Hi, History 102 class. This is a video presentation of what we would have done in class and on Zoom for February 24th, 2021. I need to be out of the classroom for a medical procedure, and so I'll see you back all on Friday after you look at this. So we already covered this slide, but I would just kind of want to remind everyone where we are before we keep moving forward. And that is, you need to develop an understanding how humans were organized, for this class especially, in the West prior to industrialization in mostly, over 90 to 95%, depending on where you are, sometimes even higher, in rural family households, either as peasants or land tenants or renters or maybe small landowners, and some large landowners who had other people doing their work. And that is the pre-industrial way of producing in the countryside. And I added that there might be, from country to country, a case where households would also be involved in more than agriculture as part of a pre-industrial process of making clothing or other articles, but they would just do a step at a time in their house, the putting out system. And then also a pre-industrial, I had on the board in our model that in the cities, there were various families who produced goods that weren't agricultural goods, and we were referring to these folks as artisans or people who work in artisans and their workshop. But that theoretically and in reality, a process occurred from 1750 to 1850 at various speeds and at various ways, in which production was brought more under one roof, where laborers who no longer own their own piece of the production are going to a manufactory of some sort and selling their labor for wages. There's division of labor where they do regimented or repeated tasks more efficiently, we might add, and that for the owners of the manufactory and for the product in general, this resulted in a reduction of how much it cost to produce each unit. One other consequence of this was that a man or woman or child's labor was more controlled by someone else rather than in their own location, right? So alongside this, we do begin to see, for the first time, a more dramatic growth in the urban centers. So cities had grown or declined from time to time over the previous 1,000 years, but this will create a process which to this day has in fact continued. And so on Monday in class, you're supposed to start to be able to understand that the movement from the self-producer on the left to the manufactory and the laborers in that manufactory to the right, that control over production, the profit over that production, how efficiently that is produced, the cost of that production has in fact changed, in many different directions. It's not all one-sided. It's certainly the one on the right is more efficient and the cost has gone down. Who gets that profit and who controls that production might be, in fact, different as well. And then very quickly, just a reminder, I reminded you to read this section on transportation changes as well, that canals, roads, railways all reduce the cost of distributing products. And so this, of course, is driving down prices. And while it does that, it increases at the same time what areas can produce. So if you look at the picture on the right of the Erie Canal, if you look, let's say, on top of the N for north on the compass in New York, between there and Lake Ontario, we can see the Erie Canal approaching. An area along the Erie Canal prior to the canal being there could not produce goods and participate in the market or capitalist system. But once the canal was there, that reduced their costs to bring goods into market. And so we see the increase, interestingly, of both production for the market economy, but also less homemade goods. They will, instead of weaving their own cloth, they'll begin to purchase cloth that's being brought along the Erie Canal. So that's from Monday. All right, so let's look in the book. It's 21.2. Look at the contributors to industrialization. We tend not to call them causes because it's not a mathematical formula, but they are processes that are going on that lead to, contribute to industrialization. The first one, and this is mentioned in your book, is population growth. And you can see figure 21.1 is a little hard to read, but basically it's trying to show you that from 1680 to 1820, population is rising. Now, a lot of this is due to mortality rates going down, so people are living longer, and in various areas, including England and in the United States of America, the birth rate was rising as well. This is a complicated subject, and I'm just going to kind of introduce you to it. Your understanding that people married very, very young a long time ago, and the age of marriage has gone up, can be true over the long run. But I think you'd be surprised how American men and women, English men and women, did not marry very early a long time ago. But during this period, they did to marry earlier than their late or mid-20s, and so as a lower marriage age, there was a higher birth rate as well. So that's something that is in fact going on in this process. So now agriculturally, population growth. Let me stick with that one more time. As the population begins to shift to an urban population, let alone the growth itself, both of them, that increases the demand for food and eventually the demand for more goods. We're going to keep our eye on demand itself. So while industrialism, think about it as kind of a self-promoting process as it draws people into the cities to work, it means that these workers now need goods to buy. And what do you know? The factories are making the goods to buy. And of course, they all need food as well. Agriculturally, you do begin to see increased production in the countryside. The book tells you a little bit about the process of enclosure and new fertilizers and new crops. And if you put this all together, what you tend to see is higher yields, per acre. There's more and more food being produced in the countryside. But one of the greatest consequences of this shift is that it takes fewer people to produce this larger food supply. So the fewer people in the countryside needed means that populations are moving to the cities and the places where the manufactories are. Right, so it's in the cities, then they demand more goods, and of course they supply more labor for these manufactories. The third element involved in this process is, in fact, then capital. Capital formulation and accumulation, as the book calls it. And what you will find that is industrialization is a very expensive process. It requires extensive capital, money in the bank that can be exchanged to purchase, bricks and mortar to make the factories and the engines and the machines. So what you'll find is in areas such as Great Britain by 1750, the economy there had produced significant capital from English enterprise, but also because England has taken its armies and navies and gone into other parts of the world and taken them over. They've become a colonial power, much further than just British North America or the USA is going to be, but over the United States. And though we haven't covered that in great detail yet, you should be aware that colonization process and the creating of colonies is subduing large territories and amounts of other people under your control to a great extent or to a less extent, and that you, as the powerful entity with the threat of violence behind it, you are extracting goods and wealth out of these colonies. That's what they're there for. And so, like Virginia, to pick on one that you may know better than the others, private capital had pooled their money together into companies, and then whatever Virginia was able to produce as a profit, and eventually they did with tobacco, then the investors would receive dividends, right? They would get profits from their investments. So, what you find is that England and the United States and France and eventually northern Italy and Germany, certainly Belgium and the Netherlands before this. The United States is kind of a latecomer. There has been a process by which certain members of society, not all of society, was able to accumulate wealth and capital. And this is an important ingredient in the process of industrialization. I study Paraguay in great detail, and Paraguay by 1811 does not have a great deal of capital. And so, even if it had some of the other contributors or ingredients, it doesn't have capital. So it does make industrialization limited in Paraguay, though not non-existent. The government there, had capital, and they tried to invest it. They did invest it, and developed an ironworks to produce iron in Paraguay. See, so that did happen. So in the countries where I said there was capital, you'll see that that was one important ingredient for industrialization. So, and then the book goes into demand from consumers and producers, right? So what you'll find is that, as already kind of mentioned, in the industrialization process, it creates the market by making urban people urban. It creates the market as consumers for these goods. And so what you'll find is that overall, city people need to buy the goods that are being produced by the factories. And so that works out to help as one of the main ingredients. Also, of course, businesses themselves need to purchase material and capital goods. So these machines you're seeing on the right-hand side, the textile businesses had to purchase these machines from the ironworks businesses. And so that also propels industrialization forward. Now, there is a consumer revolution, and that word is used a lot in this book. What that means is that there is industrialization. On one hand, the working class, as I've already mentioned, is now urban and going to need to buy goods. But industrialization also creates wealth for a part of the population that could be, 5% or 10%, kind of depends on what country you are. We refer to as the bourgeoisie. So we're going to go more into this probably in class on Friday. I might do a little bit here. I'll do it here. So if you look at the JPEG of the whiteboard and we have a picture of the factory, well, one thing that happens, we'll do this at a later slide, so I'm just going to do it a little bit. One thing that happens is a white collar class emerges. Something important, a creation of industrialism, is the industrial middle class. And all I'll say now is that they do have a greater amount of disposable income than the working class. And they want to imitate the aristocracy. They want to show that they've got scoreboard, they've got game, they have arrived. And so they will, in fact, add to the consumer shift in demand and buy as much goods as their budgets can withstand. Sometimes a little bit more, and getting into debt. So a consumer revolution definitely starts to emerge because of that. And in the first day, we talked about advances in technology. Certainly, this needs to happen before the production can become industrialized and grow. So there's that one. And here's a new one they probably maybe haven't thought of, but this is a big deal. And that is that the entrepreneurs, those folks who are creating new business models to produce goods in the factories, they reorganize the whole way goods are made. And this is a key development in that by reorganizing the entire process and where the parts of the process are located, this in itself, just changing the organization of how things are produced, makes the cost of production go down, right? This is without all the technology and all the other stuff we've talked about. Just reorganizing it creates a system that is much more efficient and therefore much more productive. So you always have to kind of keep your eye on that as well. Sometimes it's hard for us to see, but again, imagine a Blockbuster video store, right? The way that you consume a rented film versus Netflix before there was streaming. But even Netflix, being sent in the mail back and forth was an organizational change of how films would be consumed by people in the home. And then, of course, streaming, which you're more accustomed to today in 2021, is another organizational change. You can see how much more efficient it is to stream something on Netflix versus driving to the Blockbuster store, walking through the aisles, selecting a physical video that has to be there, and then purchasing it and then driving home. But of course, you have to drive back and return it, right? So when you look at the synergy, the combined energy of all of these changes put together, they really do lower the cost of production and the cost of distribution of goods at a very high level, greater than I could even put across in a video. So the book so far has looked at how new industrial technologies combined with the human use of new sources of energy, combined with reorganizing and the concentration of labor in manufacturing and the use of business models. I'm sorry, that was for that one. And then new transportation models. When you put them all together, they really combine and help each other out through this industrialization process. All right, moving on to 21.3, then. Britain was a first mover in this industrialization process, but they will not be the only ones. Industrialism emerged later in other parts of Europe, the United States, and Canada, and other regions around the world. And the process is similar to what we've looked at, though it can take a variety of different directions, right? So again, you could go to modern-day Iraq, you could go to Southeast Asia, you could go to Goa in India, you could go to Buenos Aires in Argentina and Mexico City, Tokyo, Japan, just to pick a few random ones. And you can study this process of when it starts and when it gets going and how is it similar or how is it different from the British first example. And looking at, for this class, Europe and the United States more than the other cases I've studied, because that's what the class does. Looking at the map on the left for Europe first, you'll see that Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and then France, Germany, and then northern Italy are all areas that by 1850, right, so it all depends on your timing in some ways, they are areas that are able to industrialize. When you go to east of Germany by Berlin and Russia and Poland And down in Spain, they are not as far as developed industrially as these colored-in areas. The United States, likewise, is a colored area in various parts, not all of it, of course. In the South, by 1850, only really Birmingham, Alabama, has started to have some industry. But the Ohio River Valley, for those who know your football teams, to be honest, your American football teams, those are the places where industrialism is really getting going. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis, right? Chicago, and so on and so forth. So you'll want to be aware that not everywhere industrializes at the same rate, and some areas industrialize in very limited manners. So the book wants to kind of compare and contrast them, or more contrast them to Britain, and I just want to kind of distill them into a few items. One of the differences that you see on here is that that there were factors in some places that slowed down industrialism. The aristocracy, an old school rural aristocracy, in Russia, for example, they won't be as quick to move their capital, their limited capital, towards industrializing. So you'll see that there. Yeah, you'll also see protectionist groups like the Zollverein, and others that try and keep out industrialism. So that's pretty typical. But where it does get going, a few ways in that it's different, is you'll find that governments are more active in the process of promoting industrialization than they were in Britain. And this is even true in the United States. In the United States, you may have heard, or you may have the idea, and it could be the correct idea, but the theory that, governments are inefficient, capitalism is efficient, and the more governments stay out of capitalism, the more efficient capitalism will be, and that's how we used to be in the past in the 1800s. But since 1930, we don't have that anymore, and that has some historical problems. The theory might be correct. Capitalism might be more efficient without government, but the historical argument is less true, because what you'll find in the United States and some of these other colored areas, the governments are using their resources and power to accelerate economic growth, and they do so really effectively. So there's that. Also, this is kind of a minor one. Instead of private capital, you might find in some places banks are more active. So there's that. But 3 is a little more accurate, because the railroads didn't exist in England when it industrialized at first, but they do exist later. You'll see that railroads really contribute to industrialization a little more than it does in England. So remember my Erie Canal statement that when the canal gets to areas, it starts to bring them into industrialization. That's kind of the process that's occurring in Belgium and France and Germany and northern Italy here on this map. And the 4th one is not a perfect conclusion, but is a little bit. You do tend to find that some of these areas will specialize instead of doing everything, which is more common in England, all sorts of different industries trading with each other and producing stuff. Then you will tend to find northern Italy or the western part of Germany on the Ruhr Valley there, they will specialize more into one industry. So, features of non-British industrialism, adding a little bit more. They somewhat imitate what Britain did, but they alter their approach based on their local strengths or weaknesses. And the government, again, is a little bit more involved, and railroad contributes to that. For those interested in American history, in the 1820s is this process really gets going, and that's pretty early compared to other non-British areas. Textiles are the first mover in New England. Railroads really get going. Clocks, guns, furniture, sewing machines. reapers and other agricultural equipment, and even food products. They begin to take agricultural goods and process them into foods. So if you don't like processed foods, that's something that's starting pretty early. But again, in the United States case, the South is kind of like Eastern Europe. It's more resistant to industrialization. So even in a country like France or the United States, you're going to find areas that go one way and areas that kind of go in the other way. So something to keep in mind on this section of 21.3. Now 21.4, I know we're flying right along, and because it's pretty straightforward, the consequences of industrialism. Population growth, Dr. Chambers, you said that was an origin of industrialism. Yeah, it's on both. It really contributes to a sustained growth of the population and economy over time. There are depressions in which economic growth contracts or goes the opposite way. The whole economy contracts from time to time, but over the decades, this does not happen. The population growth did worry some. They thought the population growth would outstrip production, and so we would reach a point where we'd have so many people that our food supply couldn't keep up. But that never materialized. Adjusting agricultural production with technology so far has always been able to produce more food than a population. And now I know that there are people, in the world then to now that aren't able to get food, and some perish because of it, of course. I'm not suggesting the case. Looking at the industrializing countries more than the locations outside of there where people are struggling is where that conclusion comes from. So it's a little bit of both. Migration, and we have that problem today, by the way. The food that you may be able to get a hold of, and I know we have a variety of students and professors in here who have different abilities to access food, but generally speaking, we are able to do that in the modern world so far. We'll see if that is able to continue moving forward. As far as population goes, the book also lets you know about migrations of people, and certainly industrialism does not only move people in countries from the countryside to the city, but it is also moving people from portions of the world to other portions of the world, right? So in Germany, this process begins to push a lot of rural Germans out of their hometowns, and some go to the industrializing cities, but many travel across the seas. They might end up in the American Midwest or in Canada or Brazil. There are places that the migrations go. They're not all the United States of America. And, same with as it happens in Spain, you'll find Spanish migrations of large numbers of people to Argentina, for example. So these are the types of population shifts that also are a consequence of industrialism. The greater number of people living in urban squalor or worse conditions than they had in the countryside is also a consequence. So if you look at New York, 1844, New York City, or London, you're going to find portions of those cities that the standards of living have gone down, and they contain a lot of disease and trash and animal and human waste. So that didn't exist to the extent it did prior to industrialism, when the cities were in fact smaller. Now, whether people's standard of living went up or down, well, that's both correct. You're going to find kind of the following larger takeaways from this bullet point. That if you count the beans for all the economy, for all the classes, generally speaking, over time, industrialism raises the standard of living. It does not, as you can imagine, do so equally. Those with access to capital, like J.P. Morgan on the right, are going to exponentially have standards of living that go up exponentially more than the working class. And urban poor, which is the much larger number of the population, struggle, even though the standard of living may go up from a historian's point of view. There are certainly parts of their life that go down. So when you are really interested in showing how industrialism helped, and you point to the few or the 10% that do really well, you have to at least be conscious that you are not using the 90%, or whatever the percentages might be for your case. You have to be an honest academic and acknowledge that what you're looking at may not be the majority of the population. You need to explain that away. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I'm just reminding you that as academics, we have to be honest to the whole picture and not just point out the portions that we find politically appealing. Environmental consequences, as you might imagine. The environment is much more consumed and used by the industrialization process, and that, in fact, dirtier rivers, chopped down forests that may or may not be updated, lands being used to produce more agricultural products, the soils becoming more used, erosion, on and on the list can go of some of the consequences, and that is some of the consequences. And we might be dealing with an escalation of those consequences right now. Time will tell. Males and females and children, they did labor before industrialism. So it's not as if men, women, and children working is a consequence. It's what their work life was like. Control, how long, punishments that were meted out before and after industrialization, right? There is punishment in the pre-industrial world, but it may not look like the punishment after that. And again, as previously mentioned, control over the workplace is probably something you haven't thought about, but is a big deal to the new laborers in the cities, because they can remember when they had greater control over their life. And they tend to feel that the natural rhythms of life are in fact being ruined by industrialism. So I'd like to take this moment to introduce something you may or may not have ever noticed when you are reading or watching J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and of course you may never read or watch it, and that's fine too. But this whole process is built into what Tolkien's talking about. For him, the Shire, where the hobbits live, is an ideal place. It's pre-industrial. It's rural. It's full of a variety of kooky people with bad jokes and smoking pipes and telling stories and drinking ale. That's the rhythm of life that he argues is idyllic and should be. And then in the story, I know there's two bad guys, two antagonists, but one of them we're going to concentrate now on is called Saruman, and he is more in the south, and he is taking the natural world and destroying it and industrializing it. And the trees and the tree shepherds, of course, like Treebeard, they are upset at this. And so the novel is exposing what British students for a long time period have thought about industrializing a pre-industrial rural world and an industrialized world. And again, a long time ago, I think 4 or 8 years ago, London had the Olympics, and if you go back and look at their opening ceremonies, this is the story being told. So the rhythms of life are changed in that more and more people feel that the industrial urban life is an unnatural life. It's having you live an artificial life. So there's that. And then kind of the big last point for today, although we'll have some pictures after this slide, is, and we'll get into more of this on Friday, it creates classes that didn't really exist before. And I'll just slightly go over it now, and then we'll start with this on Friday. The individual on the right, the merchant, the industrial giant, these are bourgeois people. They're the bourgeoisie. And they kind of do exist before 1750 or 1800 in a way. We've talked about the nobles of the robe and like that back in Unit 1. So there is a non-noble class that is propertied that gains its power from financing and production and banking and merchanting. They are new in that they are becoming much, much more numerous and much more powerful at the highest end. So that's something that happens. Below them, but still the bourgeoisies, you're going to have to start to kind of figure out which bourgeoisie we're talking about sometimes, is an industrial middle class. And this will be a new term for you, maybe. You might imagine the middle class has always existed. But the way we use it in this history class and most history classes in industrialism is the emergence of a new group of people that didn't exist. And these are white-collared workers. So they will tend to have access to money and education to get college degrees like you folks are doing. And they can get a degree in accounting and law, business management. They know their arithmetic and how to organize, organizational leadership, right? And these groups will have less money than the individual on the right, but they'll still be bourgeois because they will be able to own property at a lower level. And this is kind of a new thing, this industrial middle class, because you need business managers. You need someone to manage the factory. You need accountants to count up all the stuff you count, right? And you need your attorneys and you need your organizers. And so they're not going to be the laborers we've been talking about before, and they are going to work for wages. They're going to work for salaries most likely. But they are able to command much higher salaries than the less skilled or not skilled in these areas working class. And so they'll be able to purchase homes in a way that the urban working classes cannot. So one popular reference or cultural reference for this, believe it or not, I'm going to go with Tiny Tim's father from A Christmas Carol. If you haven't thought about it, Tiny Tim's father is an accountant in Scrooge's accounting firm. And by sitting at a desk and accounting all day long, he has a slightly better life than the miners in his town, if you will, right? Or the launders and those types of things. So and he's able to afford clothing that will set apart his status a little higher. But of course, it's his skills of accounting that really pay off for him. And he is in the industrial middle class, bourgeoisie. And then the urban working class in mines and factories and other places, this is new. This is really not a group that was very large or very prominent before. And the very lives they lead, as I've been mentioning, with clocks and working in someone else's factory and these types of things, this is a new reality of how life goes on. So industrialism is really altering people's lives, and I'm not going into the gender differences today, but it will. The industrial middle class and the industrial giants, like this guy here on the right, they're going to come to dominate culture, and they're going to have a bigger voice on saying what is manly behavior and what is feminine behavior. So we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll start there when we get back. Just some pictures to show that the consequences of industrialism are broad. A new way of extended families living together in urban apartments on the upper left, a new way of spending your life in the manufactory for these ladies on the upper right, a textile mill in the early 1800s altering the landscape, how the city was organized, again, environmental consequences on the lower left, and an English urban working class neighborhood on the right. Again, this is not how their grandparents had lived in the countryside, and a few of them in the city 100 years before. So it has dramatic consequences. I'll see you all on Friday in class, assuming I don't get sick or anything catastrophic happens to our world, and we'll start from here. Thanks for watching and taking notes. See ya.